So no presentation today, and I would, if you have specifically SwitchScripter installed, I would encourage you to follow along and ask questions when you want to. I have not prepared a presentation. I don't intend to write a lot of JavaScript. Well, we'll see about that. The goal is more to go over what is possible and how you can use JavaScript in Switch. And as I indicated in the invitation and in the agenda, we are going to talk about the classic Switch environment, which goes back to, I think, 2006, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere along that. I think Power Switch came out end of 2005, beginning of 2006 or something. So it goes back quite a while. But like I said, it's not so much about the JavaScript content by itself. It's more about what possibilities do you have? How can you write scripts? Where can you use them? How can you test them? Because what I've seen is that lots of people know enough JavaScript to write something, but they don't always know what the best way is to use it. And that is what I'm going to try and do. If you have questions, just unmute yourself and speak up. If you put it in chat, you can, but I'm not always sure that I'm going to see what's in there. I have a limited amount of pixels here, so I have to prioritize a bit. So no Visual Studio Code today. That is very, very sad. We are going to go to SwitchScripter instead. And if you start SwitchScripter, then you will, and actually let me do it again. So I'm going to quit it here. No, I don't want to save that. There's nothing in it. So let me just start this again and reposition it a little bit. So this is normally what you should see when you start SwitchScripter. And what exactly you see, especially here in this on the left-hand side, is it depends a little bit on the version of SwitchScripter that you have as well, or the version of Switch that you are using. I'm using fall 2020 at the moment, so I actually have access to the legacy environment, but also to the new Node.js based scripting environment, and we're going to talk about that one, I believe, 2 weeks from now, if I'm correct. But so we are going to talk about that. But I wanted to start with the classic stuff first. And SwitchScripter is a big part of it. SwitchScripter, if you've never worked with it, is what the developer would call an IDE, an integrated development environment for Switch, where you write scripts. But before we do that, I actually want to go to Switch first and show you one other possibility that exists there, and that doesn't involve all the scripting environment even. So let's see if we can do that. So let me go to Switch. I have put a 4-piece cafe test flow in there that doesn't do much, except well, take a file and run it through the rename tool, and I haven't even configured the rename tool. So if I would, and I haven't opened my folder with PDF files, which is really bad of me. And the problem is I don't have enough pixels, so I have to be. What do I do with this here? So if I would have a rename tool, I'm going to assume that you know how this works. I can add a suffix, for example, and I could say something like pre-flighted. I could also try to write it correctly. And then if I run that, it's going to do exactly what we expect if I didn't make any silly mistakes. And we get a file that is called pre-flighted. Okay, so that is simple. What do you do when you want to use an existing tool and you still want to change the behavior a little bit? And that's the first thing I want to talk about. So instead of adding a fixed string here in the rename, if you have the scripting module, and that is of course the prerequisite, you do need to have a license for the scripting module in Switch. If you have the scripting module, then you have access to what are called script expressions. And this is not a full big script. Those you would normally use with the script element that I have in the flow element pane. A script expression is a local piece of JavaScript. And the idea is that this piece of JavaScript that you can write here should return what that property, the suffix property in my case, expects. And you can see at the top here that Switch tells me that it expects a string value. Yeah? So I could do exactly the same thing as we've done before. I could say pre-flighted, and that's it. And while this looks a little bit weird, this is valid JavaScript that would evaluate to a string called pre-flighted. You can make this a little bit nicer, or well, I think it's nicer or more easily readable. So I could make a function, and then that function could return what I want. And then instead of having this weird looking half expression, I can now just call that function at the bottom. This does exactly the same thing, but especially if you're going to write a little bit more JavaScript, it might make it more clear to you what is going on here. I have a function that returns the suffix that I'm interested in, and then I call that, and that will give me a return. Now, if your script expression becomes a little bit bigger, you can actually save it and then reopen it and so on. But for simple stuff, you typically just type whatever you want in here, and then we say OK. And then in Switch, you'll see that it says script expression defined. So instead of using a fixed value or using a variable instead of a fixed value, I can do define script expression, and then that will, if we again did the same thing or the right thing, that should give me the exact same result as what we've seen before. Yeah. So I have the original job name, and then I have preflighted .pdf at the end. These script expressions are there are, at least in my mind, there are advantages and disadvantages to this. The advantage is that many of the properties of the built-in tools support script expressions. So in almost all the built-in tools and in a lot of the configurators, you can use these script expressions. And with that script expression, you can modify the default behavior of the tool, and often pretty significantly. That's a big advantage. The other advantage is you don't have to learn an IDE. You don't have to mess with SwitchScripter. You can write your simple JavaScript directly into Switch. The disadvantage for me is that if you start using these a lot, and obviously this is not going to be a problem with a flow like the one I have here, but if you have a larger workflow and you start relying on these script expressions, you're kind of spreading out the logic throughout different flow elements. So I'm going to have a little bit of a JavaScript here and a little bit of JavaScript in another flow element. And in the end, I have a workflow that contains 15 elements, of which 10 have little snippets of script expression. And that is not so easy to understand what is going on. And if you hover over where it says script expression defined, it will show you without even having to open what the script is. But you still have to know that this is not the standard tool. I'm using a little bit of script there. So it kind of spreads out the logic. And being a very lazy person, essentially, I don't like that, because it means that if I have to go back to a workflow 6 months later, it is much more difficult to try and understand where I have put what. To me, it is, and to a certain extent that is personal, but to me, it is much easier to have a larger script that brings all the logic together and that you can just look at in one go. Yeah. But remember that you have this script expression, and that sometimes it can be a very quick way of fixing something. Yeah? Modifying the behavior of a little element. If that's all you need, then fine. So that is one. That is this this script expression. And as Matthew just said, you can actually run these in or create these in SwitchScripter and test them there as well. Yeah, just to make sure that you have a test environment. You don't have to, but you can. So that was one bit. Of course, that is not the most interesting bit. What is really interesting in Switch, and the reason that when I talk to customers and they ask me, can I do this? The answer is normally yes. The only question is how long it's going to take. Yeah? The real reason for that is that not just the fact that Switch is very flexible with the built-in tools and so on, but it is the script environment that you have to go with it. Because whenever you run into a situation where Switch doesn't do what you want, you can normally work your way around it with a custom script. Of course, there is a danger to that as well. And the danger is, especially if you ask a developer to do so, which I identify as, that, well, if you give someone a hammer, everything starts looking like a nail. So in the end, you end up with very complex workflows with lots of scripting going on and so on and so on. So it is important to find the right balance and only use script elements if there is something that you want to do that you can't do in Switch. You would do really good to also understand what all the built-in tools do so that you can use a built-in tool and not reinvent it in your own scripting, if that is possible. So how do we get started with scripting? Well, I can drag a script element on here, but if I do that, I won't be able to connect to it, for example, to start with. Why? Well, because the behavior of a script element in a flow depends on the script that was written in it. And when I drag a new script element on here, it doesn't have a script yet. So I would have to choose the script package that I want to use for this script. And before I do that, I won't be able to use it in a workflow. So we're kind of stuck with Switch at the moment. We have to go to SwitchScripter first and write our script there. And this is also, even if that wasn't the case, this is definitely the good way of doing it. The purpose of SwitchScripter is to offer you an environment where you can write a script to begin with, but where you can also test the script. And believe me, if you use those capabilities of testing it, that is going to be much faster than writing a script, putting it in the workflow, and then using the Switch workflow to test everything. There are some cases, limited cases, but they do exist, where it is not possible to really test the behavior that your script implements in SwitchScripter. And the biggest one that I found is when you write a script that wants to look at a whole bunch of files waiting in its input folder at the same time. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Yeah. So SwitchScripter is the environment where you write scripts and where you can test them as well. And that has a really weird name, and I'm probably partially to blame for that, but I don't remember, and I'm going to blame someone else. I think it was Peter Kamps who invented this terminology. But it has something that is called a fixture setup. So you can choose between the declaration of the script and what they call fixture. And fixture well, just translate that as the test environment, because that is what it is. Yeah. So we need to start in the declaration part, because that's where we're going to set up what our script is going to do. What you might have to do, depending on the version of SwitchScripter and so on, is you might have to make sure that you're working with the legacy scripting environment and not with the Node.js-based scripting environment. In the Node.js-based scripting environment, I can't write a script in SwitchScripter. SwitchScripter is still used, as you will see in 2 weeks. It's still used, but it's not used to write the actual script. Typically, you will use Visual Studio Code in that case. If you are using the legacy environment, then SwitchScripter is where you actually write the script itself as well. So now it is editable, and I can write JavaScript in here. Okay, so what are you looking at here? Well, everything in SwitchScripter is important. It's that easy. And if you want to be efficient with the tool, you have to understand what the different bits and pieces do. Yeah? Where it says declaration on the left-hand side defines the properties of your script. And those are simple things like the name that it's going to have, or the description that it has when you hover over it and stuff like that. But it's also going to determine how this particular script integrates in a switch flow. And that is super important. Yeah, so it defines things like which connections can I make to this script element? Can it have incoming connections, or is it something that generates jobs? Can it have outgoing connections, or is it an endpoint flow element? How many connections can there be? What type of connection can there be? Yeah? All of these things are determined by this declaration part. And I'm going to set this up in a second in a we're going to do something that is very simple. And then my plan is to show you a little bit, and we'll see how far we get. But my plan is to show you how you can upgrade your script and make it a little bit more fancy as we go along. So that's the declaration part. That dictates or describes how your script element is going to function inside of Switch. The second part, and we already talked about that, is the script environment itself. And luckily, SwitchScripter already puts some default stuff in there. And you can see 3 functions that are defined in there, and that are access points for your script. These are functions that you have to get the name correct, and you have to get the signature correct, meaning they have to have the right parameters as well. And these are functions that are called automatically by Switch when certain things happen. And they are fairly self-explanatory. There is a job arrived entry point, and job arrived entry point will be called anytime a new job arrives at your script. Yeah? And it gets information from Switch. It gets something called Switch, which determines the Switch environment. So you will be able to use that to get information about the switch where this is running in, but also your flow element itself, for example. And it also gets something that is called job. And job is, as you would expect, the job that just arrived at your script and that triggered the script. So typically in this entry point, you will use this S and this job parameter, do whatever you want to do, and then give information back to Switch so that the job can go on to the next stage in the workflow, or maybe it needs to be deleted because it's not a good job, or so anything that you want to do when a new job arrives will happen in this job arrived. This is probably the default, well, no, not probably, this is the default entry point in a script. Yeah? Most of the scripts probably will use job arrived. There are two alternative ones that are included. The last one you might not have if you have a really old version of Switch. The second one is timer fired, and again, very, very self-explanatory. Timer fired will be called by Switch every so many seconds, and you can determine how many seconds are in between invocations. And this is something that you would uncomment and use in the case that you don't want a job to trigger an action, but you want to do an action every 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 2 hours, whatever it is. It's not an either-or situation. You can definitely come up with possible scripts that would both use job arrived and timer fired. Yeah. If you don't need it, you comment it out, and then it won't bother you. You comment it out, or we just delete it because we're not interested. Yeah, you don't need to have it. You will need to have one entry point, because if you define no entry points, then your script is not going to do much. And then the third one is a little bit more advanced still, where this is called webhook triggered. Now, if you don't know what a webhook is, a webhook typically is a way to connect different systems together. If I have an online ordering system and I want Switch to do something every time a new order comes in my online ordering system, then a number of these systems have the capability of calling a particular URL whenever an order comes in. And that URL can be captured by Switch. And this entry point, webhook triggered, is what will, well, you need to set it up, but you can set it up in such a way that it will be called each time that outside system calls a Switch system. Yeah. So I have something outside that can call a URL, has an API that can call a URL from on the outside of Switch, and whenever something happens there, that will happen. And then with these parameters that I have here, I can set it up in such a way that my script is called when that happens. We're not going to do that today because it would lead us too far, but there is an entry point for that. So we're going to delete that as well. So what do we need? Well, we're just going to use this function, and I'm going to write it in such a way that my OCD is happy, which would be this. So we have our job arrived, and the job arrived at the moment doesn't do anything, and that is absolutely fine. So let me save this, and I will put it on my desktop somewhere. So we'll just call that tests, and I'm going to save that. Now we have a script file, but we haven't set up how this script is going to integrate into Switch. So before we go back to Switch and see if we can load this script, we're going to do that. And how do you do that? Well, there are some parameters that you need to fill in. A lot of this, or a lot of these, you could keep the default values. And there is documentation about these that you can see. I'm just going to fill out the ones that are important here. The name of the script is an internal name for the script, and the default here is SwitchScript 0, which would work. Normally, I use this inverse. Let's call this cafes test. I use this inverse URL notation that I think comes from Java at some point. I don't remember, but it's a good way of doing it. It just has to be unique. And this is what Switch uses to identify your script. So if you would modify the version from 1 to 2 at some point, and you want Switch to realize that this is the same thing, then you need to keep this unique ID the same in your script. Now, you don't want this to show up in Switch. That is not easily recognizable for people. So we want a display name, and that could be something like rename job. That already exists probably in We'll make it more descriptive. Add suffix to job name. There. So this is the name that by default is going to appear if I drag my script element, or if I have my script element in the Switch environment. And I can then rename it in a flow. That doesn't matter, but this is the default that is going to be used. You want it to be script. You have two possibilities here, actually. You have script and app. App is if you want to create Switch applications, which we're not doing at the moment, so we're just keeping that to script. We want the legacy environment, and then the legacy environment also supports some other things. It used to support 3 different scripting languages: JavaScript on both platforms, AppleScript on the Mac, and Visual Basic Script on Windows. I think someone was smart enough to kill off AppleScript at one point. To be honest, the only thing I ever use is JavaScript, and that is the default as well. So it includes a JavaScript. It doesn't include a VB script in my version. You can have keywords, which will help with search and so on, but we're not going to bother. I can have a tooltip, which, well, if you hover over the icon in the flow element pane would normally show up, but our script is normally not going to show up there, so that is not that important. You can give it an icon. Yeah? And of course, this is very useful. If you don't use that, you get a very generic looking icon. And what you preferably would do here is to come up with something that represents the functionality of your script, and this icon is going to be used in the flow. So I could say choose file, and I happen to have just had some icons for scripts that we don't have real icons for yet from our in-house designer, and I'm going to use one of those. The icons have to be, if I'm not mistaken, 32 by 32 pixels. They have to be a PNG file. And you can do whatever you want, but like I said, ideally, this is going to be shown in a flow. So ideally, you have an icon that represents what that script does in your workflow, because that is visually going to make it much easier to understand what the workflow does. You can password protect a script, and by all means do so, but don't do it when you start writing it, because that's going to be a pain. Every time you open the script, it's going to ask you for the password, and you're going to do that 5 times, and then you're going to decide to remove the password while you're developing. Yeah, so if you want to password protect things, do it when you have a version that is finished, and you don't want other people to be able to see what you've done or modify what you've done. Then you can do it. Don't lose the password, or you're going to be, well, I don't think there is anyone who can help you find the password again if you lose it, so don't. And now it becomes interesting. A flow element, one of the powerful things in flow elements in Switch is that they all have different ways you can connect them in a workflow. How many incoming connections can you have? How many outgoing connections, and so on. And that you set up here as well. So we're going to do a rename. We're going to add a suffix to a job name. And how do we do that? Well, I need to have files coming in or jobs coming in, because otherwise I can't rename them. So yes, I want an incoming connection. And I'm going to say that I require an incoming connection. Yeah, that makes sense. If there are no incoming connections, my job arrived can never be called, and my script is basically going to do nothing. So this is the default, and normally it works well. I can also decide how many outgoing connections I want, and in many cases, that would be one. You have a very simple script where you say one file, a job comes in, and then I'm going to process it to the next stage of the workflow. So to keep things simple, I want one incoming connection or multiple incoming connections, and I want one outgoing connection for the output job. So I can set that to 1. And then the other thing that is important is I can also say require at least one. Remember, we're adding a suffix to a job name. If I don't have an outgoing connection, I really am not doing anything. So yes, I need to have at least one outgoing connection. And then the connection type. And we're going to start with a simple move connection. If we have time, we'll also look at traffic lights as well. Yeah? But a move connection is a normal connection as you would have in Switch. A filter connection is one where you can add filters to it. A traffic light connection is one where you have this red and, depending on the country you live in, orange, amber, or yellow capability for warning, and then green for success. So a traffic light connection would allow you to specify multiple outputs, for example, for error conditions and for success conditions. So let's start with something that is very simple and keep it to move. You can keep execution mode to serialized, although normally, especially in production, it probably makes more sense in many cases to move it to concurrent. But so all the default settings that you have here for a simple script are actually not bad. Yeah? The main thing to modify is the name that you have there, both the symbolic name and the display name. Give it an icon so that you recognize what it does, and then make sure that it's the legacy environment if that's what you want to use, and then you're more or less set. Okay. So we haven't talked about flow properties and stuff like that. I will, but not now. We'll come back to that. I'm just going to save this. And well, it would be nice if it would actually do something. Yeah. But before I'm going to make it do something, let's see if we did enough to make it work properly in Switch. So I can say choose script package. And if I am not mistaken, I put it on my desktop. And you can see that the icon appears. So, and the name appears as well. So we've done something wrong, right, sorry. I'm so used to doing things wrong. So that succeeded. But you also see that it has this exclamation mark. So we haven't done everything right, apparently. Well, we just haven't connected this properly into our workflow. So I'm going to delete this, and I'm going to make a connection. And now it accepts my connection because, of course, I have set up the script element to say there needs to be an incoming connection. And I also said there needs to be an outgoing connection. So I can connect this thing to the out folder now as well. And now I no longer have anything that happens here because now it is set up correctly. Can I actually now activate the flow? Well, the answer is yes, I can activate the flow. And what is going to happen if I put a file in there? Let's see if we have, yeah, put it in there. What happens? Absolutely nothing. Why? Well, I haven't done anything in my script. So Switch will call this job arrived entry point in my script, but my script doesn't do anything. It doesn't talk back to Switch. So it doesn't know what to do. So it's just going to lead to this job is going to stay there for the next 200 years, basically, and until you write some JavaScript in there. So let's deactivate that and go back to SwitchScripter. Okay, so we have to do something. What do we have to do? Well, in general, in most Switch scripts, you have to do two things. You have to do the business logic that you're interested in, and then you have to communicate to Switch so that it knows what to do next. And we're going to start with that second point. And the second point is that we need to tell Switch that once we're done with our business logic, it needs to take this incoming job and it needs to send it to the outgoing connection. Yeah, and luckily that is made very simple. I can do job, that is this, the job that we get. And when I type job, and this is one of the reasons why doing this in SwitchScripter is actually quite nice, I have completion. So for the job object, I have a whole bunch of stuff that I can call. Yeah. So a whole bunch of get functions that give me information about the job. For example, I could look at the private data that comes in with the job and a whole bunch of other stuff. And I also have functions to modify the job. Maybe I want to add a hierarchy thing to there. Maybe what else can I do? I want to set private data, or I want to set the job state. So this job object lets me manipulate all of the properties, most of the properties of that job that is moving through my flow. And what you see in there as well is a number of send functions. And these send functions you can call to tell Switch what it needs to do with your job. Yeah? And they are relatively straightforward. I can say send to null, and then the job will disappear. I can say send to single. I can use send to data or send to log, and those relate to those traffic light connections. We only have one outgoing connection, so I'm going to do send to single. That seems like a logical thing to do, so let's do that. And that requires two arguments. The first thing is required, and that's a little bit strange, is it requires the path to the thing that you want to send on. What do I want to send on? Well, I just want to send on the file that came in. So why make it so complex? Well, it was made complex in that way because in many other scenarios, this is actually a very useful thing to do. But we just want to send on what came in. So job get path. And then you have a name, and that is the name that the outgoing file is going to have. Yeah. And for now, I'm not really interested. So I'm going to delete that and say, this is good. If I don't pass a name, Switch is automatically going to use the name of the incoming job. And for now, that is exactly what I want. Okay, so let's save this. And we'll be nice and type a comment in there. And let's see what that means. So now if I go back to Switch and I restart my workflow, I get this message. What that says is that Switch detected that one of the scripts in your flow has been modified. Yeah, and I don't know who invented this dialog box, but well, the only option you have is say proceed. If you say abort, then the script is not going to be updated, but your flow is not going to be activated as well. So let's just agree with updating it. And now let's see whether something happens. There you saw the 0 appear, and now my job is on the other side. Yeah. So if I do that again, and let's throw away what we have here so that we can see what happens. If I put a job in, it's going to move it to the output. So we haven't done anything. We're just sending through the unmodified job. But what we have done, and that is important, is we have integrated it with the logic of Switch. This now works exactly the way that Switch expects a script element to function. Yeah? So now we can make it more interesting. How do we make it more interesting? Well, let's start by coming up with a new name for this job. And I'm going to take some shortcuts here. But what I can do is I can say, if you followed these JavaScript sessions, you should remark that normally I would type let here. That is not supported in the script environment, in the classic script environment. So we have to work with the var keyword here. So I'm going to calculate a new name. What is the new name that I want to give? I want to add a suffix. So I need to know what the current name is. And luckily that is not so difficult. I can say get name, and I have two options, get name and get name proper. Get name would include the extension. Get name proper doesn't include the extension. So that's the one that I want. And then I want to add pre-flighted. And I want to add, and now I am not certain. I am never certain whether get extension includes the period in there or not, but we'll figure it out. Okay, so calculate a new name. This gives me a new name, and now I need to use it. And I said, well, when I send on a job to the next stage, I can ask Switch to rename it in the process. So all I need to do is pass this new name in this thing, and then I will be done with it. Yeah. And my backstage assistant tells me, thank you, that it doesn't include the dot, so I have to include it here. Now, instead of going, I can do two things at this point. I can save this, and then I can go back to Switch and run it and see what happens. And then I would find out whether it includes the dot or not, and so on. Yeah, but that is okay to do for once. But if you're developing a longer script and you have to go back between here and then to Switch and activate the flow again and drop a new file in it and so on, you're going to go absolutely bonkers. And that is not good for anyone. So we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to go to this fixture environment. So remember, I'm in the declaration section of my script. So I see all the properties of the script and so on. I also have a test environment. And we're going to use that to show what it does and how we can test our script. See also here at the bottom that I have a log, a personal log for the script. So I don't have to go watch the log messages in Switch. I can test my script locally here and immediately see what happens here at the bottom in the script. And that is, of course, absolutely fantastic, because that makes for a very quick turnaround in the things that we do. What we need to do to set it up is we need to specify incoming jobs, because otherwise we can't test. So I can take a job here and I can drag that on top of the test pane, and then SwitchScripter will remember that thing. And it will actually do two things at that point. It will create here at, you can see it on my desktop. So I have my script, which is called .script. And I now also have an sfixture file. That sfixture file is the test environment. Yeah. Okay, let me move this back out of the way. There. So that is the test environment. If I now want to copy the script somewhere else, and that is important, if I want to copy this script file somewhere else, you have to be aware of two things. First of all, if you want to keep your test stuff, your test setup, you should copy the sfixture file as well, because otherwise it's going to lose the test environment. Yeah? At the same time, if you've developed a script and you want to put it in your production environment, don't copy the sfixture part. Switch doesn't mind. You won't be able to test where you've copied it to, but on a production environment, you probably don't need the test environment anyway. Yeah, but that is important. Second thing, if you copy that script somewhere else, Switch is going to break now, because what we did on the Switch side is we pointed to the location where that script lives. So if I physically copy this or move the script somewhere else, I will also need to move the location here in Switch. So you'd better decide where you put your scripts and then not change that folder too much afterwards. Okay, so we have a test environment. I have a test file here. You can see that for that test file, I can set up a bunch of stuff here at the bottom as well. Why is that? Well, it's a test environment. If I build a Switch workflow and I know that in that Switch workflow, I have some private data attached to the job, and I want to be able to test that environment in my scripter, then I have to be able to set up the same environment. So if I need private data, I could go here and say, oh, for that 8 pages job, I'm going to say that I have FP job name, and that is Penguin, of course, obviously. Yeah, and when I say okay, I now have private data fields attached to that test job so that I have here. And that means that in my script, when I run a test, it will not only find the job, it will find a job that has private data attached, or that has email information attached to it, or that has hierarchy information, or has an XML data set attached. All of these things can be set up in that test environment. And to test this, I'm going to do one additional thing, and that is I'm also going to make an outgoing connection. Strictly speaking, you don't have to, but then you get additional error and warning messages at the bottom, and I hate that. So I know that my script is supposed to have one outgoing connection. Yeah. Well, I can add that. Simply click the little plus here, and then I add an outgoing connection, and I can rename it and say the single connection or whatever I want to do. And there we are. And now I have a test environment that I can use. How do I use it? Well, you select the file that you want to test with, and I can have multiple. And that is something that I very often do as well. You have a good file, a bad file, you have a file with a particular problem that you want to test. Add all of them to the incoming jobs section, and then you can just select the one that you want to test. And here at the top, you can say, invoke the entry point. Invoke the entry point means simulate what would happen if a job arrives in a Switch workflow in this particular case. And you'll see a long list of entry points, and I have almost none. Well, I only have job arrived here. You can see the timer fired and webhook triggered that we talked about as well. There's a bunch more that you would use in certain situations. For now, what we want is job arrived, and I'm going to say run. And then at the bottom, it is going to simulate what would happen in Switch itself. Yeah? So it says starting evaluating the script, executing the job arrived entry point, which is what we want. And then it says done. And it says the job 8 pages preflighted.pdf was placed in the output folder. And that shows me that the rename that I've done here is probably correct and is probably what I want. It added the underscore preflighted. My backstage helper was correct. The dot was not included, so it's a good thing we included it in the script. And it is a PDF file. Yeah? So that name looks correct, and I think that my script now does what it should do. If it doesn't, it is of course now very easy to iterate and make a change and so on. And I'm going to make one change just to show you that that is also possible in this test environment. I'm going to say, well, we want to show what happens. So I could say job log, and then I'll write the incantation first, and then I'm going to tell you what it is. I have to be careful because I've been using the Node.js environment and it's slightly different. So now I question myself when I'm writing things. So what does this do? This tells Switch to add a line to the log. The -1 stands for debug, so it's only going to show up in the debug messages, but in SwitchScripter, debug messages always show up, so that's not a problem. And then it says job renamed to, and I add the new name of the job that I'm proposing to add. Yeah. And let's run that again. You don't even have to save it. I can just run it again, and then what we see now is that this blue message, which is indeed a debug message, is now job renamed to 8 pages pre-flighted.pdf. And that's exactly what we were hoping that was going to happen. So now we're even more sure that this is correct. But you can see that you have, from this script environment, you have the ability to communicate to the switch log as well. So I'm doing this now with a debug message. I could just as well say that I always want to show that, and maybe in the job log I really want to show what I'm going to rename it to, and 1 stands for a normal message. So now it's a normal info message. If I would change that to 2, it would be a warning. If I change it to 3, it would be an error message. Yeah. So from within a script, I can communicate and put stuff in the log messages. I would encourage you to do so, but do it smartly. You don't want to generate 1,500 log messages from a script, because generating log messages costs a surprising amount of time, actually. But also, you kind of pollute the log, and if someone is looking for something, it becomes hard to find it. But especially warning and error messages, make sure if something goes wrong that you write that to the log, or whoever uses your script will have no idea what's happening. Yeah. So probably this I would not write to the log. I would probably keep it to a debug message, so that if someone really wants to see what's going on, they have the information. But in the normal switch log, debug messages are not shown, or they're hidden. And so you wouldn't pollute the normal processing log. It's just there if someone really needs to find out what's going on in there. So run that again, we're back to that. And now what I can do, of course, is go back to Switch. If I double click, the flow is going to be activated and it's going to give me that error message again. I can also force it to reload the script package here, and then I don't get the error message. It's annoying both ways, so you can choose which type of annoying you prefer. Let's pick another file. And then we'll see what happens. It says pre-flighted. And now if we go to messages, and if I would switch on debug, I can see the job renamed to line that I have in there. Yeah, but I'm not polluting the normal switch log. In fact, I believe it's still the case that the normal preference for switch, or the default setup, would not even log debug messages. You have to switch on a preference in switch to enable that. So we've created a script that renames the file and then moves it on to the next bit. Now let's make it still a little bit more interesting. And I have a fixed thing here called pre-flighted, and that's a little bit annoying. That is not so good. So we can make our scripts more intelligent, and we can make them more intelligent by giving them their own properties. This is what you see for all flow elements that are built in, for all configurators and so on. They have properties, and setting the properties changes the way that they operate. Yeah. So if you really want to write good scripts that are reusable in multiple workflows, think about what properties you can give them. What can we have here? Well, it would make sense to make a property for the suffix that we want to add. How do we do that? Well, we give it a name. So something like tag suffix. You don't have to do the tag bit. I do all my properties with tag, but that's just me. This is how it's going to be called in Switch itself, the friendly name if you want, and then you can add an explanation when you hover over it. So the suffix that will be added to the name of the job. And then, and this is important, the editors that you want to provide for your property. What are editors? Well, that says, is this a property where the user needs to type in a number? Does he need to type in a text? Is it something where you want him to select from a pull-down menu? Is it an outside library property? Yeah? You can do all those things. So we're asking for a piece of text. So single line text sounds right. And then what I normally do is I always include single line text with variables in that case, because that makes it more usable. And then I'm also going to include script expression. And that sounds a little bit over the top, because now I'm writing a script and the properties of that script can also use a script expression to be modified. But it doesn't cost you anything to enable that. And it, again, makes it much more powerful. What else do we need? What is the default? Well, this is my default. So if I don't modify the script, then it's going to use this. Depends on master. That doesn't make sense for one property, but I could have a property here that says add prefix or suffix. And then if the user says suffix, then I show a suffix property. If the user says prefix, I show something else. Yeah. So I can have properties that depend on values of other properties. And that is what this depends on master allows you to do. And then validation can be switched off, in which case I can do whatever I want. Or I can do standard, which means checking that it's not empty for a string. Yeah? Or I can do custom, and custom would mean that I can write a function in my script to do the actual validation. So we're going to leave that to standard here. If I go back to my fixture part, so the testing part, you'll see that my script now also has that property here. Yeah. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to copy the default value, so I'm going to add something there. And I have the different editors that I selected as well. So this lets me, again, the declaration allows me to set it up. The fixture part allows me to validate that what I've set up is actually correct. Okay, so we have a property, now I need to use it. How do I use it? Well, I'm going to do some housekeeping here, and I'm going to split this up into two parts. So this is the suffix that I want to add to my name. Where does that come from? It comes from a property. How do we do that? So this is my, my suffix. And there is the S variable that you have, which represents switch, the switch environment, but also the flow element and so on, has a function called getPropertyValue. And getPropertyValue takes the name of the property, a job in rare cases. I don't think I've ever used that. And it returns the value that the user selected. So I can say, I want the value of the suffix property, put that in there. And now that I have it in there, I don't want to add preflighted to the name, but I want to add that tag to the name instead, that suffix. And that should actually be all that is necessary to do. So if I run this again in my test environment, I now have that thing that adds penguin at the end. So that seems to work. If I do something that is slightly more complex and I say, well, let's go to switch and add a date to that. There. So now I have a variable. And if I run it again, it's going to show me the job and then added to the end the date of today that the file was processed. Yeah. So that is why I say when you have properties that you set up, it doesn't cost you anything except for a few seconds to think about what you're going to do here. It doesn't cost you anything, but adding single line text with variables or any of the other editors that make sense for the property that you have, and adding script expression makes it a lot more powerful because now I can use the switch variables to modify what's going to happen there. Okay, so what happens when I go back to switch? Well, we have our, you can see that there is no property here. That's because switch hasn't gotten the message yet that this has changed. So I can say reload, and now I get the suffix and I get the default value. And if I also want to add the date, I could make it easy for myself and just copy that, that bit that I have here. And we're going to simply copy that in there as well. There. So run, and we'll call a file in there. And then on the output side, I get that same file with a date at the end. Okay, so this is about the time that I have for today. But I think I've shown you the essentials of what you need. Yeah, you have this way of using JavaScript inside, also VBScript, but for most practical things, I would just forget about that. You have the way, you have the possibility to use JavaScript inside of Switch. You can do it with a script expression, which gives you a way of writing a very small piece of JavaScript to modify the behavior of a property or something like that in an existing flow element. But you also, and importantly, you have a Switch scripting environment where you can create your own scripts, your own flow elements from scratch. Yeah? Where you can, on the one hand, define how they are going to work inside of Switch, for example, by defining the properties that your script has, defining the ingoing and outgoing connections, the icon, the name, and so on. And then you can write JavaScript code to implement the functionality. Yeah. At the same time, you have a fixture environment that allows you to test that script inside of SwitchScripter before you go back to Switch and test it there. Normally, when I write scripts, I will create them in SwitchScripter, test the hell out of them, and only when I'm reasonably certain that they behave correctly will I put them in a Switch workflow and test them there. Yeah. And if you're using the test environment in a good way, the chance that Switch breaks after it tested successfully in this environment, in this test environment, is really small. You can actually you can do a lot of the quality control right here inside of SwitchScripter. So that should set you on your way. I'll leave you with two exit notes, footnotes. One is that I probably have forgotten the second one by the time I get behind the first one, so you're warned. The first one is that this is an old script environment. Remember that I said this when we talked about JavaScript. The Switch documentation says this is JavaScript version 4, which is a lie because JavaScript version 4 never existed. Yeah, but it is about that time period. So it's old, and any new thing that you think you might be able to use, forget about it. You're not going to be able to. Yeah. I would even go as far as to say, don't search online for JavaScript solutions if you want to use them in the classic environment, or be very careful, because more than likely the help you're going to find online is not going to work. What you can do is there is documentation for it, and you have to look for the scripting legacy help pages, and that will tell you, for example, what you can do with the job class and so on. But it will also, and this is probably the part that I use the most, it also has a reference for the JavaScript version that it supports. If you want to know, for example, what you can do with strings, well, there is documentation on all the methods that are supported. If you go online and you look at a Stack Overflow answer on how to do something, and then you try that in Switch, the chances are very high that it's not going to work because it uses some modern feature that is not supported. So be careful about that. The second part is you have 2 weeks to experiment with this, and then in 2 weeks you can come back and we're going to talk about the new Node.js stuff. And then you're going to be completely confused because it is subtly different than, well, first of all, the architecture is completely different. So we're going to spend most of our time talking about the architecture, but the API that you have here is also subtly different. Yeah. And that is something to look out for. For example, a job sent to single does exist in the new Node.js environment, but it does not take a path. It automatically always sends the job from where it came in. And you might think, yeah, that's a great idea. Actually, it's not. Yeah. It has as many disadvantages as this one has. It is just different. And the fact that it's different, you have to watch out for that. So I would say if you're going to write scripts, if you're looking at starting to write scripts in Switch, and you haven't done so far, I would go as far as to saying maybe it's wiser to wait until you've also seen the Node.js environment, and then you kind of decide which of the two you like the most, and you focus on that. If you haven't done this in the past and you start looking at both of them, there is some risk that there is going to be some confusion on what works in one and what works in the other, and so on. So you have to be a little bit conscious of that as well. But I hope at least that you've seen that creating a script that starts to work in a flow, to configure it so that it does what you want it to do in a flow, and to link it in with the behavior that Switch expects to move jobs around and so on, is not that terribly difficult. Yeah, and a lot of the rest of the challenge is figuring out, okay, so what are the methods that I can use to communicate with Switch and get information? And there is documentation for that. And then the remaining challenge will be, how do I implement my business logic? Last thing I'll say is that if you invest time in writing scripts, please also think about, and I'm not saying this to make my life easier because I don't care, but also think about doing it the proper way with properties and so on, and linking it correctly in Switch, because that is going to make your life easier. If you write scripts in your company and someone else uses them, then it's going to make their life easier as well. So it's worthwhile thinking about, what do I want to do? And if it's something that I want to do, can I make it more flexible by adding some properties? Implementing properties is a pain because you have to define all of them and the name, and if you're good, you have to think a tooltip, and so it's a pain if you have to create 15 or 20 of them. But it is worthwhile if you write something that is a little bit more complex, because it will pay off afterwards. You'll have something that is much more powerful and nicer afterwards.